Well, good morning. When was the last time you saw the lack of genuine community in someone's life cause their world to unravel? Unfortunately, I see it a lot. If you look close enough, I think that you too will see it, if you can't think of a specific time right now, all around you. People try to live their lives on their own. They try to figure out life all by themselves. Far too often, people have little to no support, zero accountability. Many of these people try to numb their loneliness with some sort of pleasure. Many try to cover up their lack of community by staying super busy, maybe having numerous surface-level friendships. I'm a strong believer that anyone living outside genuine community with God and His people will suffer. Currently here at Epoch, we are in a series that deals with our purpose as followers of Christ. We're calling it the mission. In the first week, we looked at the Great Commission, the call to make disciples. The second week, we looked at Acts 2, where we find key characteristics that define the early church. And this is where we draw from for our fourfold mission. You've heard about this a lot during this series, but worship, fellowship, spiritual growth, and service. And last week, we started looking at each one of these aspects. And Scott began by looking at worship, and I was sick as a dog, and so Scott, thanks for filling in for me last week. As for this week, we're going to focus on another one of these aspects, fellowship. And let me take a quick survey real quick. If you look at these four right here, how many of you would say, especially those that are committed members here, how many of you would say that you feel like overall fellowship is maybe our strongest? Raise your hand. Okay, that's a good number. Now, do this for me. If you feel like it's one of the others, I want you to raise your hand. Okay. So I think overall, based on just the quick survey, this is one of our strongest, if not the strongest. At least that's what we're saying. And I believe it to be true in many ways. I think this is a way that God has really encouraged us as a community, is to see that this is something that is a part of our DNA and our culture. We can always do more, and that's what we're going to talk about this morning, is I want us to focus on fellowship, but I'm excited to be a part of a church where I can invite someone and not be super nervous about what someone might say to them. And don't get me wrong, I still get nervous on some of you guys, okay? But you get nervous too of what in the world I'm about to say, so we're even. Well, one popular place that we can look a little closer at this specific aspect of our fourfold mission is in Hebrews. And I want us to look closer. I think we still can learn a lot, gain a lot. And those that are guests or that have been coming for a little while and trying to learn what it looks like to be a part of this community and to understand the mission of the church as a whole, that's what we're looking at. And so if you have your Bibles, I want you to grab them and turn to Hebrews. And before we dive in, we'll have the text on the screen in a moment. But let me give you a quick little crash course. As a whole, the book of Hebrews was written to strengthen folks that were considering giving up on their faith. There was pressure. And in a sermon-like way, the author goes back and forth with instruction, encouragement, in hopes of inspiring this fragile community to persevere, to stay the course, and to fix their eyes on Jesus. I don't know about you, but I'm always up for some encouragement. So when I get to Hebrews, there's some really strong truths there, but there's a lot of encouragement. A call to fight and endure. I don't know about you, but sometimes life has a way of just hitting you dead on. And when it hits you head on, you have this idea of, what do I do now? And that's where we need to pause for a moment and say, what is our purpose here on earth? What is our purpose as followers of Christ, as a community of God? As you look specifically at the text that we're going to be dealing with, you begin to also see that the author has been preparing us all along the way for what's about to come. In fact, to make sure we're all caught up, he kind of gives us this brief summary in verses 19 to 21. We're going to be in chapter 10. And so the journey so far, he gives us this brief intro, and we're going to read it in just a moment, but the best part about this is when you jump right in the middle of the book, it's nice to know what in the world's going on. And then immediately following this summary, we see that the author urges us to participate, to respond to the person and the work of Jesus Christ, to draw near, which is a technical term for worship, which we talked about last week. This fourfold mission, it's intertwined, they overlap. And so we can't see one of these without seeing the other as to what our purpose is. But that's not all. The text goes on to say, and this is what I really want us to look at, is that out of this invitation to draw near, we see that it's not merely private, it's also public. And so listen closely to this. The Christian life was never meant to be lived in isolation. Simply put, we need each other. I need you, and you need me. And this is where I want us to camp out. So if you have your Bibles, grab them. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 19 through 25, focusing specifically on verses 24 and 25. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, that is his body. And since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and with the full assurance that faith brings, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience, and having our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another all the more as you see the day approaching. There's wonderful truths jam-packed into this text here in Hebrews. But I want us to look specifically at verses 24 and 25. It's in this final word of encouragement of these verses where the author of Hebrews urges us to consider. Now this word consider is to notice, to pay attention to look closely at something. And so what comes next demands concentrated thought. Here's what he says. Listen closely. This is important. He doesn't want us to miss it. Consider how we can spur one another on toward love and good deeds. This is the overall goal or the target. This is what he is encouraging this fragile community and encouraging us on. That is that we should stir each other up toward caring for one another in a way that it affects our actions, our emotions. We're to spur one another on. Now, to spur one another on, this idea means that we're to provoke one another. Now, hold on. I know some of you are already poking and prodding the person next to you. We all know what it means negatively to provoke one another. And this has this idea, but in context we see that we are to switch this idea around of provoking in a negative light, but instead we provoke one another towards love and good deeds. And so love isn't just going to happen. Thought and action are required. Community requires action. Fellowship, genuine, the fellowship, to exist as the community of God, it takes action. And so this passage is emphasizing the responsibilities that we have towards one another. And so when we think about our purpose, we can't think about our purpose without thinking about the context of our lives together. And what does it specifically mean for us? How are we supposed to relate to one another? Well, given this context of a fragile, persecuted community, it was much safer to just stay at home. The pressures were starting to mount. In fact, there's no telling exactly what would happen as they gathered together if they were caught, coming together, worshiping the Lord. But they knew it was important to give encouragement, to have genuine care and concern for one another. It was a necessity. I wonder if that has watered down when the pressure isn't always there on us. I think it's easy to drift into isolation, to assume community can be found in other ways. If we're being honest, I do think, though, that encouragement is absolutely imperative. With everything online and feeling like we know what's going on with each other's lives, why don't we rip some of these facades down to see the heart of how we really do need one another? We need encouragement. We need someone to listen to us, to care, to genuinely provide. Words of wisdom, maybe a meal, a shoulder to cry on. It sounds simple, but my goodness, the bodily connection that we have in community is slowly starting to dissolve today. And that's why I think we see this call. And ultimately, the author is urging that the expression of love within the fellowship, that it be deepened and extended. And so even if you have a sense of feeling like you are engaged in the life of this community, how can we deepen and extend that fellowship, that love, that community? Especially as the times are starting to squeeze and the culture in the world is starting to squeeze us. What actions, words, and deeds do you currently participate in to provoke others in this community towards encouragement and love? How are you spurring one another on? I know some fantastic testimonies of how that is taking place. Donald Guthrie puts it this way: something more than individual effort is needed if love and good works are to be fostered. Christians must be alert to each other's needs, and corporate action is indispensable. Some of us fail in this area, others thrive. But look at verse 25. Just in case you think you got this down, all the more we're told to spur one another on, all the more. And so generally speaking, what does this mean to spur one another on in love and good deeds? Look at verse 24. This phrase, love and good deeds, is deliberately this broad phrase that covers all kinds of activities. It's as if he's saying, there's so many things, we don't have time to talk about this, but just all this stuff that you know that I'm talking about. And I think it translates over pretty good, but if you want a little more specific idea of what it means to spur one another on toward love and good deeds, it's this idea of a caring response to the needs of others, a tangible expression of compassion. We need each other, don't we? And this sort of genuine biblical fellowship embodies compassion, humility, self-sacrifice, kindness, gentleness, generosity, and service, which we'll talk more about in a few weeks. But the author goes on, in case we're not grasping fully what's happening, he goes on to talk a little bit more into detail of what this idea of spurring one another on means. And he says two things: what we must not do and what we must do. There's this idea of the negative idea of approaching what we have to avoid, instead what we're to fill with. And so he begins by saying that we are to respond by spurring one another on, by not giving up meeting together. That translates over pretty well. Apparently, some in the community were abandoning their gatherings. They were forsaking opportunities to serve God and one another and to show deep, loving compassion. And although God would never forsake them, some of these folks were forsaking God and others. And this is a serious abandonment with strong repercussions. Encouragement cannot happen in isolation. In some way or another, due to normal affairs as well as persecution, some of these folks had cut themselves off from the whole, and it was causing them to shrink back. It was affecting their faith, and it was affecting the faith of the community. Do you know someone that's cut themselves off from the community? Do you know someone that is drifting? And not only do they need us, we need them. We need each other. We can't give up meeting together. This abandonment was severing opportunities for these individuals, and it was hindering opportunities for the whole. Did you ever think that maybe within community life it's not always just about what you can come and receive from others, but the fact that you too can give generously of your words, of listening, and of your actions? It was threatening the whole, bringing disaster upon the individual. So the author urges them, don't give up meeting together. Now, while this should be obvious, let me make this as clear as I can. Hebrews is not saying that church members must be at church every time the doors are open. Yet on the other hand, Hebrews is not saying that a monthly or occasional surface level involvement within the community is genuinely enough to experience true community. I don't say this to force you into community. That defeats the whole purpose. It's a need. You need to be in community so that you can grow and thrive and experience words of encouragement. Not, oh, now feel bad by this rebuke and show up. That's not the motive. That's not the heart. But we need each other, and that's what we're getting at here. That's what we're hopefully seeing. The principle behind this part of the author's challenge has to do with the consistent involvement in the life of the people, the church, the community, rather than the frantic activities of all the programs. Let me say that again. The principle behind what we're seeing here is more about the consistent involvement in the life of the church and the people of God, rather than some involvement in a frantic active programs of the church, carrying those out. And so I'm not going to give you a guilt trip when you're not showing up on a Sunday, but I'd like to think as a leader here in this community and the other leaders as well, and even fellow people within this community, we should be concerned whether or not others are involved in the community life of what God's doing amongst His people. We should care that people are meaningfully engaged on a consistent basis. I should care deeply whether or not people are worshiping, fellowshipping, growing spiritually, and serving together, and you should care as well. As a community, we need to live these essential aspects of a Christian life together, and we need to allow the Spirit to teach us all how these characteristics can be played out in our everyday. This last week for us was insane. On Sunday, for whatever reason, I did have sushi about 8 o'clock, raw sushi, salmon, last Saturday night. May have been something to do with that next day that was brutal. But I wasn't able to preach, and that was the start of what I thought was going to be hopefully, hey, okay, things are going to get better. Then I get a call Monday. I sit down to get my coffee and start working, and all of a sudden I get a phone call. My son is not doing well. He's turning gray, a little lethargic. So I rush home. We're on the way to the hospital. He's a little lethargic and not responding at all. I start freaking out, of course, as if my anxiety wasn't high enough and my stomach wasn't turned upside down enough on Monday. Then we find out the next day my daughter has strep. My son not only had RSV, and he's okay now, but he also had double ear infection. This was by Wednesday. Other than that, we've had a boring week. But it got better. Yesterday it was wonderful because everybody seemed to be stabilized. I didn't want to sneeze or blink. But we accomplished so much in one day. It was amazing. But what I'm getting at, as we think about this, life has a way of hitting us. And we need each other. And there's no realistic way that every one of you could have showed up for every single situation that we were going through, right? It just doesn't work that way. I did get numerous texts, calls, people listening, encouraging. And some of you are probably going to kick me for not telling you more so that you could be involved. What I'm getting at is, as we think about encouraging one another, there is a human aspect that has limitations of so much that we can do for one another when we're struggling. But if I don't listen to you, if I don't have an opportunity to be engaged with you in a way that we can talk and maybe go deeper than just surface level relationships, which is why we have family groups, by the way, another level of engaging with one another, sharing prayer requests, praying for one another, texting each other during the week. If we don't have these things, then we're really just gathering together for an event. There's a lot more that's available in the life of a community. I love getting coffee with many of you, crying alongside of you. I love seeing you encourage one another and encouraging me. Community is essential. We can't live this life alone. We can't give up meeting together. The second way that we are to see what it means to spur one another on is not only to meet together, but to encourage one another. To encourage one another is to strengthen one another. Listen to this. To encourage one another is to give another courage. Maybe some of you need courage this morning. Perhaps by us gathering together, we can be sensitive of how to encourage someone next to us by giving them courage. To cause another to have strong faith. And this is done by both word and deed. Also, notice this. This is something we kind of just add to the end and just kind of push through because it kind of intimidates us a little bit. But look at the last verse here in verse 25. Not giving up meeting together, some of the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. It's kind of odd and dreadful when we think of the day of the Lord because all we tend to do at times is think of the judgment aspect. But what we have to do is we have to think that judgment in the light of God's severe mercy is that God is going to right all the wrongs. He's going to fulfill all of His promises. And He's going to give us the fullness of what has already started. These are things that we should be looking forward to, not hiding under the covers about. And this should prompt us to make the most of every opportunity because this life is frail. And you are not meant to live it alone. Without spending a ton of time on this, it's imperative that we keep God's story in front of us. All of it. It's a wonderful story that is a living story that allows us to let our lives intersect to see that we have a Savior, a Lord that loves us, and we have an amazing ending, and our past is redeemed, and that gives hope and injects into our present. And if we don't have that, then no wonder when we hit a wall, why we just lay down. That's why Hebrews was written. Endure. That day of the Lord's coming. You should be longing for it like Christmas, and you should be telling everyone else that there is something to look forward to that speaks into your present, redeems your past, and gives you a bright future. So never forget this world isn't our home. Our work is not in vain. God wins. And if we allow it, our future can speak hope into our present. I don't know about you, but I need that word. I need to know that we should encourage one another all the more as we see the day approaching. It's coming. There's a lot more there, but it's important for us to see that. And so don't let another day slip by without realizing, no matter how difficult the day, that your faith and other people's faith is worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Your future is secure, and it's a bright future for those of you who follow and trust the Lord. So in the end, here's what's being said. Spur one another on toward love and good deeds. First, by not giving up meeting together, or we'll shrink back, we'll lose ground and possibly turn away. And second, encourage one another all the more as we await and long for the day of the Lord. The entire community must assume responsibility to watch that no one grows weary or gives up. Think right now for a moment. As we begin to wrap things up, I want you to be able to let this be more than just a message of encouragement. I want this to be something that spurs us on to spur one another on in love and good deeds. And so think specifically, how is God urging you to be engaged, to know that we should let no one grow weary and give up, that we should exercise genuine ongoing care for one another. And so listen to this. I love how this kind of captures a little bit of what's being said. This idea of community and true fellowship. It means being here together, being real together, being bound together, and being here for one another through the long haul. That's why I'm thankful that fellowship is important to our purpose. So I want to end with a question for you to reflect upon. How can you deepen and extend your love within this community? Some of you are still maybe looking for a community, trying to wrestle with what a biblical community is all about. We would love to help you along that journey. We're not going to force you into our mold, but we will encourage you to find that place. But what does this mean? How can God use you to bless others? And how can you be involved so that we can be a part of blessing you? How can you deepen and extend your love with this community? Think of someone. Is someone falling away that you need to text or call? Is there someone that talks to you quite a bit that you kind of listen to a little bit, but you're kind of like, you're bothering me this morning? You know who I'm talking about. Monday's coming. You're going to see them tomorrow. And when they come in, perhaps maybe instead of just ignoring them, you lean in. Perhaps there's someone that you can just know to extend the love. You can just break through with moving past the surface level and just encourage someone to the point where it almost, not to just shock them, but it almost causes them to think, why are you encouraging me? Sometimes we wonder, well, I don't know how I can extend my love and be engaged in these ways. Many of you offer meals for one another. Many of you encourage and do these things, but there's always more that we can do, not just out of obligation, but because of what God's done for us, because we have a great high priest, because someone's given us a bright future who has addressed our past. Let's make the most of this time. And so that's why I wanted to take a moment to encourage and motivate, because that's what the heart of what's happening here is. So specifically for you, how is God urging you? Maybe there's someone on your heart, on your radar. I know for me, I've been wanting to think through what are some ways that I can do this. And there's this process where when we listen to people at sometimes, we hear someone talking and we do this thing called pivoting. We move from what they're talking about, whether because we're nervous or because it rings something up in our mind. And it's not always a bad thing. But I've tried to be a little more present in the moment, even if there's some pain there or some struggle or some honesty or vulnerability that someone's sharing. And instead of just pivoting out of that, I'm trying to be present in the moment. Pray for me as I do that. What about you? We've been blessed and encouraged. And I want you to be encouraged now so that you can go and encourage others. Here's what I want to do. As we close, I want us to take time before we just leave and say, okay, we had a time to talk about this. I want us to do something. And guess, I want you to know that this is something that you can take advantage of, and you can just also kind of stand and observe if you'd like. But in just a moment, I'm going to have us stand, and the band can slip up here. But if everyone will just, in groups of 4 or 5 people, I want you to just gather for just a moment, and 4 or 5 people, and just ask this question. Is there anything specific that we can know on how we can pray for one another? It'd be silly for us to talk about this and not at least allow an opportunity. And so let's do this. Let's stand together. Instead of talking about the Super Bowl tonight, let's take a moment and just ask one another. So in groups of 3 or 4, maybe there's someone that's new. And if you don't have anything specific, just say, I'm okay right now. But let's just take a moment, where you're at, groups of 3, 4, 5, whatever it is. And ask that question. What's one specific way that maybe we could be aware of how to pray for you? As you're chatting, if someone would just, at some moment, maybe be willing to pray for the group. continue just to chat about maybe specific things in your life. And at a good point, someone just pray a prayer over one another. Let me pray for us, and I encourage you to continue your conversations as you've chatted with people. I'm thankful for this community that loves one another deeply. May we do that all the more as we await all the promises that God has for us to be fulfilled. Our Father, thank you so much for our community with you. That's where it starts. Within the Trinity, that you would invite us to the table, to know that we are welcomed, wanted, just as we are. And yet, Lord, as we come to the table, we can't help but see there's so much goodness and richness that is offered for us. And I pray that we would feast together upon you and your word, that we would serve and share with one another, that we would fellowship generously with humility and encouragement, that we would have listening ears, and at times when words need to be spoken in love, but boldly, that we wouldn't shrink back, knowing that we need you and we need one another. Thank you for community. Thank you for biblical fellowship. May we be reminded of our purpose and how important that is.